rain doesn't wash away betrayal, it just makes it stick to your skin. When Conrad locked the heavy oak door of his penthouse, the deadbolt's click sounded less like an ending and more like a snapped bone. He called Claire a parasite, a nobody who dragged down his precious legacy. He didn't know the legacy was hers. All of it. You're about to find out what happens when a nobody decides to foreclose on a billionaire's entire reality. Water pooled inside Claire's left boot, soaking slowly through the thin cotton of her sock. It was a cheap boot, bought at a discount shoe rack in a strip mall 2 years ago, to maintain the fiction that she was exactly who Conrad thought she was, a struggling freelance graphic designer with bad credit and a grateful heart. Now, standing on the polished granite steps of the Holden Group's residential high-rise, she realized the zipper was broken. The cold bit into her ankle, sharp and relentless. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body was too busy shivering, processing the sudden drop in temperature from the climate-controlled 72 degrees of the penthouse to the biting, damp 40-degree November night. Miller, the night doorman, stood just inside the glass vestibule. His hand hovered over the brass handle. He wore a crisp navy uniform with gold epaulets, looking like an extra in a period war movie. But his eyes were full of a thoroughly modern, suffocating pity. He mouthed the words, "Are you okay, Mrs. Holden?" through the thick, soundproof glass. Claire looked away. She couldn't stomach his pity. She pulled the lapels of her thin wool coat tighter around her neck. The fabric smelled faintly of wet dog and bus exhaust. It was a stark contrast to the scent that still clung to her hair. Conrad's signature blend of expensive vetiver, old leather, and the peaty smoke of the Lafroig he'd been drinking when he handed her the eviction papers. 30 minutes ago, she had been sitting on their Italian leather sofa, the material so soft it felt like human skin. Conrad had stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city grid, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal heavy-bottomed glass. The ice had made a hollow, clinking sound against the rim. "It's not just about the money, Claire," Conrad had said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced baritone he used for press conferences. "It's about alignment, synergy. You're a sweet woman, but sweet doesn't close acquisitions. Sweet looks out of place at the Met Gala. I need an equal, someone who understands the weight of a legacy." He hadn't even looked at her when he said it. He had been looking out at the skyline, admiring the glowing blue logo of the Holden Group atop the adjacent skyscraper. He loved that logo. He loved the company his grandfather had built, the company he had recently taken the helm of as CEO. Sitting on the edge of the sofa, Claire had noticed Bethany's reflection in the glass table. Bethany, the chief operating officer of a rival tech firm, sitting with her legs crossed perfectly at the ankles, picking at a microscopic flaw in her blood-red manicure. Bethany hadn't spoken a single word. She hadn't needed to. Her presence in the penthouse at midnight, wearing a silk slip dress and an expression of profound boredom, had communicated everything Claire needed to know. "I signed the prenup, Conrad," Claire had whispered, her voice sounding raspy, pathetic even to her own ears. "You don't have to throw me out tonight. It's raining." Conrad had finally turned to face her. His jaw, the one she used to trace with her thumb when he fell asleep reading quarterly reports, tightened with irritation. "Don't make this messy, Claire. My lawyers have secured a temporary apartment for you in Queens. The driver is waiting downstairs. Take your clothes, leave the jewelry. We both know you didn't buy it." but she had. She had bought the jewelry, the penthouse, and technically the very chair he was sitting on. Claire stepped off the granite curb now, the rain matting her dark hair to her cheeks. She tasted copper. She had been biting the inside of her cheek so hard it had bled. She spat a small amount of pink saliva into the gutter, watching it swirl down the iron grate. There was no driver waiting. Conrad had lied about that, or simply forgotten to arrange it in his rush to get her out and get Bethany into his bed. The street was empty, glistening black under the halogen streetlights. Every passing taxi had its off-duty light illuminated, rushing past her like she was completely invisible, and maybe she was. For 3 years, she had worked tirelessly to be invisible. She had buried her maiden name behind a labyrinth of blind trusts, offshore holding companies, and legally binding non-disclosure agreements. She had wanted, with a desperate childish ache, to be loved for the mundane, boring, imperfect Claire. Not Claire Vanguard, not the sole heir and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, the private equity monolith that had quietly acquired the failing Holden Group 2 years prior to save it from bankruptcy. She had authorized the bailout anonymously because she loved him. She had watched him stress over margins and layoffs, holding his head in his hands at the kitchen counter, and she had made a single phone call to wipe away his debts. She let him believe he was a genius who turned the company around. She let him believe he was a self-made titan. Now, he was tossing her into the gutter because she didn't match the upholstery of his new life. A delivery truck sped by, hitting a pothole and spraying a fan of muddy, icy water across her shins. The shock of the cold water on her bare skin finally shattered the numbness. Claire let out a short, ugly sound, half gasp, half sob. Her chest felt hollowed out, like someone had taken a melon baller to her ribs. She was a billionaire, richer than the GDP of several small countries, and she was freezing to death on a sidewalk because she had been stupid enough to believe in a fairy tale. She began to walk. The broken zipper on her boot clicked with every step, a steady, mocking metronome. Click, drag, click, drag. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away from the glowing blue logo in the sky before she did something she would regret. Or rather, before she did something Conrad would regret. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, emitting a high-pitched, mosquito-like whine that drilled directly into the base of Claire's skull. The 24-hour diner at the corner of 8th and 42nd smelled aggressively of burnt coffee, old fryer grease, and industrial pine cleaner. It was the kind of smell that stuck to the back of your throat. Claire sat in the farthest corner booth, her wet coat shedding a puddle onto the cracked red vinyl seat. A rogue spring poked sharply into her thigh through her damp jeans. She ignored it. She wrapped both hands around a thick ceramic mug, relishing the heat bleeding into her numb, red fingers. The rim of the mug was chipped, revealing a dark gray porous material underneath the cheap white glaze. Brenda, a waitress with a heavily penciled-in brow and a name tag pinned crookedly to a stained pink apron, had poured the coffee without asking, without even making eye contact. Claire appreciated the indifference. In a world that fawned over wealth, the brutal apathy of a late-night diner was weirdly comforting. She took a sip. The coffee tasted like battery acid and burnt walnuts. It was perfect. Setting the mug down, Claire reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed past a crumpled tissue and a singular, loose-breath mint before finding her phone. It was a 3-year-old model with a web of cracks radiating from the bottom left corner. Conrad had offered to buy her a new one a dozen times, but she had always refused, claiming she was attached to it. Really, she just needed a device that couldn't be easily traced to Vanguard's secure servers. She pressed the power button. The cracked screen illuminated her face, casting a harsh, bluish pallor over her features. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass before it fully woke up. Mascara had flaked and run down her cheekbones, settling into the tiny, exhausted lines around her eyes. Her hair was a tangled, wet rat's nest. She looked like a stray dog. She looked exactly like the nobody Conrad had accused her of being. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. She unlocked it and opened a secure, encrypted messaging app disguised as a generic calculator. She typed in a 12-digit passcode. The screen blinked, transitioning from a gray keypad to a stark black interface with a single contact listed Gregory. Gregory wasn't just her lawyer. He was the architect of the Vanguard fortress. He was a man who spoke in decimals, a man who found emotions highly inefficient. He had advised against the marriage. He had vehemently protested the anonymous bailout of the Holden Group. "You do not feed a wild dog and expect it to learn table manners, Claire," he had said, sitting in his sterile, soundproof office 3 years ago. She had ignored him. She tapped the call button. The line didn't even ring. Gregory answered on the first second of connection, a habit that always made Claire wonder if he actually slept or just powered down like a machine. "Vanguard," Gregory's voice came through the cheap speaker, crisp, dry, and alert, despite it being 2 a.m. "It's me," Claire said. Her voice cracked. It wasn't the commanding tone of a CEO. It sounded reedy and frail. She cleared her throat, coughing against the harsh diner air, and wiped her nose on a scratchy, thin paper napkin from the metal dispenser. There was a micro pause on the line. Gregory didn't ask how she was. He processed the audio data of her voice and reached a conclusion. "He filed the papers. Worse. He threw me out," Claire said, staring at a brown stain on the Formica table. "Tonight, Bethany was there. He told me I was dead weight. He told me I didn't understand legacy." Gregory exhaled. Through the phone, it sounded like the hiss of a hydraulic press. "I see. And your physical location?" "A diner, somewhere in Midtown. I'm fine, Gregory. I'm just wet." She rubbed her forehead, feeling the gritty residue of city rain on her skin. "I feel stupid. God, I feel so profoundly, agonizingly stupid. Stupidity is temporary. Legal ownership is permanent," Gregory stated, entirely devoid of sympathy, which was exactly what Claire needed. "Shall I initiate the asset unmasking? We can have the penthouse locks changed by a tactical team in 40 minutes. I can have his personal accounts frozen before the Asian markets open." Claire closed her eyes. The image of Conrad standing by the window, swirling his scotch, so utterly convinced of his own superiority, flashed behind her eyelids. He thought he was playing chess, moving her off the board to make room for his queen. He didn't realize she owned the board, the table it sat on, and the building they were playing in. A dark, acidic thrill began to bubble in her stomach, cutting through the nausea of heartbreak. She didn't want a tactical team. She didn't want an email from a lawyer to tell him he was ruined. That was too clean. No, Claire said, her voice dropping an octave, steadying into a rhythm that made Brenda the waitress glance over from the counter. No lock changes, no frozen accounts. Tomorrow is the Holden Group's annual shareholder meeting. It is. He plans to announce the acquisition of Bethany's tech firm, a merger that will theoretically cement his position as sole, uncontested CEO, assuming the majority shareholder, which is a blind trust controlled by you, votes in favor. Gregory rustled some papers on his end. He believes the trust is managed by a passive Swiss bank. Let him announce it, Claire said. She traced the rim of the chipped mug with her index finger, feeling the rough texture. Let him get up on that stage in front of the board, the press, and Bethany. Let him feel like a god. And you, I am going to attend. Claire looked down at her sodden clothes. She squeezed a handful of her wet wool coat, feeling the dirty water seep between her knuckles. I need my wardrobe trunk from the vault, and the physical bearer shares for the Holden acquisition. Have a car pick me up at the Four Seasons in 5 hours. Understood, Gregory said. Welcome back to the world of the living, Ms. Vanguard. The line clicked dead. Claire sat in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. The diner door opened, letting in a blast of icy wind and a couple arguing loudly about a cab fare. The mundane chaos of the world kept spinning. She looked at her cracked phone, then dropped it into the half-empty mug of battery acid coffee. It hissed, bubbled, and the screen went permanently dark. The nobody was dead. Claire stood up, dropped a damp $50 bill on the table for a $2 coffee, and walked back out into the rain. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She only felt the singular, burning focus of a woman ready to burn an empire to the ground. Sunlight hurts when you haven't slept, but it hurts worse when it reflects off the sterile, polished surfaces of a 5-star hotel bathroom. Claire stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the Four Seasons penthouse suite, the one kept permanently on retainer by Vanguard Holdings. The heavy blackout curtains in the bedroom were drawn tight, but the bathroom was an explosion of bright white marble and chrome. The contrast made her eyes ache. She turned on the faucet, letting the scalding water run over her wrists. The physical sensation grounded her. She watched the steam rise, fogging the edges of the mirror. 3 hours ago, Gregory's team had delivered the reinforced titanium wardrobe trunk. It sat open in the bedroom, smelling faintly of cedar and dry cleaning fluid. Inside was the armor she hadn't worn in 3 years. She reached for a towel, the heavy, high-thread count Egyptian cotton, feeling alien against her skin after years of using the rough, bargain bin towels she had bought to stock the apartment she shared with Conrad. Shedding the nobody persona wasn't just a mental shift. It was intensely physical. She walked into the bedroom and dropped the towel. From the trunk, she selected a tailored charcoal wool suit by Alexander McQueen. The fabric was stiff, structured, and utterly unforgiving. As she slipped her arms into the blazer, she felt the sharp lines of the shoulder pads alter her silhouette, forcing her posture straight. It didn't feel like clothing. It felt like a weapon. Next came the watch, a vintage, platinum Patek Philippe. The metal was shockingly cold against her inner wrist. The clasp snapped shut with a definitive, heavy click. It was a watch that commanded silence in a room. It was a watch that Conrad, with all his newly acquired wealth, couldn't even get on a waiting list to buy. Claire sat at the vanity. Her hands were shaking slightly. She stared at them. They weren't shaking out of fear, but from the adrenaline flooding her system, a toxic mix of grief and anticipation. She opened a tube of matte red lipstick. She applied it mechanically, feeling like a soldier painting on war colors. She blotted her lips with a tissue, leaving a perfect bloody stain on the white paper. Her stomach churned. A wave of sour nausea pushed up the back of her throat, forcing her to grip the edge of the vanity until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't a sociopath. The betrayal still felt like a physical weight sitting on her chest. She had loved him. She had remembered his coffee order, massaged his shoulders when the quarterly reports were bad, celebrated his victories as if they were her own. Destroying him wasn't going to be fun. It was an execution, and executions are always grim. She took a slow, rattling breath, swallowed down the bile, and stood up. Across the city, the Holden Group headquarters hummed with the manic energy of an anthill before a storm. Conrad stepped out of his private elevator onto the executive floor, breathing in the scent of fresh espresso and heavily filtered air. He felt invincible. He adjusted his silk tie, catching his reflection in the tinted glass of a conference room. He looked sharp. He looked like a man who owned the world. "Morning, Mr. Holden." His assistant, a nervous young man named David, hovered near his office door, holding an iPad like a shield. "The board members are assembling in room A. Miss Bethany's team has just arrived in the lobby." "Excellent," Conrad said, striding past him. He didn't ask about Claire. He hadn't thought about Claire since the door clicked shut last night. She was a footnote, a lingering administrative error he had finally corrected. He walked into the massive glass-walled boardroom. The long mahogany table was already filling up with the older gray-haired board members who had initially doubted him, the men he had slowly manipulated and bought out over the last 2 years. He offered them tight, victorious smiles. Today, he would announce the merger with Bethany's company. It would dilute the power of the anonymous Swiss blind trust that held the majority shares, effectively giving him absolute operational control. He took his seat at the head of the table. The leather chair squeaked slightly under his weight. He checked his phone. A text from Bethany. "On my way up. Ready to make history, darling?" Conrad smiled. He pressed his palms flat against the cool mahogany wood. "Let's get started, shall we?" he announced to the room, his voice echoing off the glass walls. 10 floors down, a black Maybach glided to a halt in the semicircular driveway of the Holden Group building. The driver, a silent mountain of a man in a black suit, opened the rear door. Claire stepped out. The city noise, the honking cabs, the sirens, the hum of millions of people seemed to mute itself the moment her black stiletto hit the pavement. The morning air was crisp and clear, a total reversal of last night's miserable rain. She looked up at the towering glass monolith. At the very top, the blue Holden logo was barely visible against the bright sky. Gregory stood waiting by the revolving glass doors, holding a sleek black leather portfolio. He didn't smile as she approached, but he offered a curt nod of approval at her attire. "The proxies are filed," Gregory said quietly as she reached him. "The front desk security has been notified of a VIP entry, though they do not know your identity, only that the majority shareholders' representative has arrived." "They don't know it's me," Claire stated, adjusting her cuffs. "They expect a Swiss banker named Herr Muller." I imagine they will be somewhat surprised. Claire pushed through the revolving door. The lobby of the Holden Group was an intimidating expanse of white marble and cascading water features. It was designed to make visitors feel small. Claire felt entirely at home. She walked toward the main security turnstiles. Two guards in sharp gray suits moved to intercept them, holding up their hands. "Excuse me, ma'am," the taller guard said, his tone polite but firm. "This area is restricted to employees and badged guests. You'll need to check in at the front desk." Claire didn't slow her pace. She didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the private executive elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. Gregory stepped smoothly between Claire and the guard, flipping open the black leather portfolio. He presented a gold-embossed, heavy-stock card. It wasn't a visitor badge. It was a primary access key card, coded to the highest possible security clearance in the building's mainframe. A clearance that superseded even the CEO's. "We are bypassing the front desk," Gregory said, his voice carrying the quiet, terrifying authority of old money. "This is Ms. Vanguard. She owns the turnstile you are standing behind. Now, step aside." The guard glanced at the card, then at his handheld scanner, which had just lit up with a solid green light and a message that made his eyes widen in panic. "Override. Owner access." He stumbled backward, bumping into his partner. Yes, ma'am. Apologies. Right this way." Claire walked past them, the click of her heels echoing off the marble floor like a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds of Conrad Holden's life as he knew it. She stepped into the private elevator. Gregory followed. "Top floor," Claire said softly, staring at her own reflection in the polished steel doors as they slid shut. "Let's go say hello to my husband." Pressure built behind Claire's eardrums as the private elevator swallowed the 60 floors to the executive suite in complete silence. Her stomach operated on a 3-second delay, plunging and rolling with the altitude change. She gripped the cold steel railing installed along the mirrored wall. Her knuckles, pale and tight, betrayed her. She forced her fingers to uncurl, one by one, pressing her damp palm flat against the metal. Gregory stood beside her, a statue draped in charcoal wool. He smelled of dry cleaning fluid and unscented soap. He hadn't checked his watch once. He didn't need to. Men like Gregory operated on an internal metronome that dictated the collapse of companies and the transfer of billions. "Respiration," Gregory murmured, not turning his head. Claire exhaled sharply through her nose. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. The McQueen blazer felt like a cage around her ribs. She was suffocating in her own armor. Last night, she was a discarded wife weeping in a puddle. Today, she was an executioner. The whiplash was enough to make anyone violently ill. She swallowed down the acidic burn of the diner coffee still coating the back of her throat. The elevator decelerated with a soft, barely perceptible hum. The digital display blinked. 60. "I don't feel powerful, Gregory," Claire said, her voice sounding thin in the small space. It wasn't a confession. It was an observation. "Power is rarely a feeling, Ms. Vanguard," Gregory replied as the polished steel doors slid apart. "It is a blunt instrument. Apply it where necessary." They stepped out onto the thick, noise-canceling carpet of the executive vestibule. The air up here was different. It was hyper-oxygenated, cool, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive, fresh-cut lilies arranged in massive glass vases on a floating reception desk. The receptionist wasn't at her post. She was likely hovering outside the boardroom, managing the catered breakfast for the board of directors. Through the thick, frosted glass walls of the primary conference room 50 feet down the hall, Claire could see the blurred silhouettes of 20 men and 2 women. She could hear the muffled, booming cadence of Conrad's voice. She walked toward the sound. Her stilettos sank slightly into the plush carpet, muting her approach. A predator stalking prey in fuzzy slippers. The absurdity of it made a harsh, dry laugh catch in her throat. As she reached the heavy double oak doors, Conrad's words bled through the wood, clear and arrogant. And so, by finalizing this acquisition with Horizon Tech, we don't just secure our market share. We absorb the competition. We streamline the redundancies. A pause. The distinct sound of a heavy glass pitcher pouring water. Bethany and I have outlined a roadmap that aggressively restructures the legacy divisions. It's an evolution. And frankly, it's about time the Holden Group stopped apologizing for its own ambition. A low murmur of masculine agreement rumbled from the room. Claire didn't knock. She didn't pause to take a deep, cinematic breath. She simply placed her hands flat against the brass push plates and shoved the doors open with her entire body weight. The heavy hinges groaned, a deep, protesting sound that sliced through the polite applause inside the room like a chainsaw. 22 heads snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. The smell of the room hit Claire in a wave. Roasted coffee beans, hot electronics, the starch of expensive dress shirts, and the sharp, metallic tang of Bethany's heavy floral perfume. Conrad was standing at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table. He had one hand resting casually in the pocket of his bespoke navy trousers, the other holding a laser pointer. His smile, wide and predatory, froze. The muscles in his jaw locked. He blinked once, twice, his brain struggling to process the visual data. He was looking at the woman he had kicked out into the rain 12 hours ago. But she wasn't wearing a damp, cheap wool coat. She was wearing a suit that cost more than his first car, and she was looking at him with a dead, flat stare that sent a violent shiver down his spine. "Claire," Conrad said. The booming baritone was gone. His voice cracked, sounding like a teenager's. Sitting directly to his right, Bethany lowered her gold pen. She was wearing a pristine white sheath dress, her legs crossed. Her perfectly arched eyebrows drew together in deep irritation. She looked from Conrad to Claire, her lips parting in a silent sneer. "Conrad," Bethany whispered loudly, her tone dripping with venom. "Did you not handle this? Why is she here?" Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Richard, an older man with a bulbous nose and a silver comb-over, who had served on the board since Conrad's grandfather's tenure, cleared his throat. "Conrad, is there a domestic issue we should be aware of? This is a closed meeting." Claire stepped over the threshold, letting the heavy oak doors swing shut behind her with a definitive, echoing thud. Gregory stepped in right behind her, a dark shadow carrying a leather portfolio. "There is no domestic issue, Richard," Claire said. Her voice didn't shake. It surprised her. It resonated off the glass walls, calm, cold, and devastatingly clear. "My marriage ended at midnight. I am here for the shareholder meeting." Conrad's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The veins in his neck pushed against his tight silk collar. The shock was rapidly morphing into blinding rage. He took a step toward her, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Claire, have you lost your mind?" he hissed, keeping his voice low, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "You are having a psychotic break. Security is going to drag you out of here in exactly 30 seconds. Leave, now, before I have you committed." He reached for the sleek black intercom button embedded in the mahogany table. Claire didn't move. She watched his finger hover over the button. "Press it, Conrad," she said softly. "Ask them why they let me up. Ask them why my key card overrides yours." Conrad's finger twitched. He looked at the intercom, then up at her. A bead of sweat broke out at his hairline, catching the harsh glare of the recessed lighting. The stale smell of his sudden, acute fear began to cut through the room's sterile air. "Who is this man?" Bethany demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Gregory. She was losing her patience. The elegant facade was cracking. "Conrad, if you can't control your ex-wife, I will call my own security." Gregory stepped forward, placing the black leather portfolio flat on the polished mahogany. The sound was a sharp slap against the silence. "My name is Gregory Vance. I am senior partner at Vance, Liddell, and Pierce." Gregory unzipped the portfolio. The metal teeth of the zipper sounded incredibly loud. "I represent the majority shareholder of the Holden Group, the entity holding 68% of the voting rights." The room went entirely still. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to drop a decibel. Richard leaned forward, his watery eyes narrowing. "You represent the Swiss Trust, Herr Müller?" "There is no Herr Müller," Gregory stated flatly. He extracted a thick stack of heavy stock legal documents, bound by a thick brass clip. He slid them smoothly down the table. They stopped perfectly in front of Richard. "The trust is a blind entity. The sole beneficiary and the ultimate bearer of the shares is standing in this room." Conrad let out a harsh, bark-like laugh. It was a desperate sound. He looked at the board members, throwing his hands up. "This is absurd. She's a graphic designer. She makes flyers for local bakeries. She doesn't have a dime to her name." "Correction," Claire said, walking slowly toward the table. She ran her fingertips along the edge of the mahogany. The wood was smooth, warm from the ambient heat of the room. "I maintained a freelance graphic design business to avoid going insane from boredom while you talked about yourself for 3 years. It was a hobby." She stopped directly across from Conrad. He smelled like vetiver and panic. "Look at the signatures, Richard," Gregory instructed the old man. Richard fumbled with his reading glasses, pulling them down from his forehead. He flipped through the first 3 pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. The silence stretched, tight as a piano wire. A drop of sweat rolled down the side of Conrad's face, tracing the line of his jaw before dropping onto his silk tie. Richard looked up. His face was the color of old oatmeal. He looked at Claire, a profound, terrifying realization dawning in his eyes. The holding company," Richard stammered, his hand shaking so badly the paper rattled against the table. "Vanguard Holdings." "Yes," Claire said. "Conrad," Richard whispered, turning to the CEO. "She owns it. She owns all of it." "No." The word fell out of Conrad's mouth, hollow and stupid. He lunged across the table, snatching the documents from Richard's trembling hands. He tore the pages, his eyes darting frantically over the ink. Vanguard Holdings. Sole proprietor, Claire Vanguard. He read it again and again. The letters seemed to detach from the paper and float in the air, mocking him. He dropped the papers as if they were covered in acid. "This is a forgery," Conrad gasped, backing away from the table. He bumped into his leather chair. It squeaked loudly. "This is a pathetic, desperate forgery. You think you can waltz in here and fake documents of this magnitude? I'll have you arrested for federal fraud." Bethany stood up. The silk of her dress swished in the quiet room. She didn't look at Conrad. She was staring at Claire, her eyes performing a rapid, brutal calculus. Bethany was a shark, and she had just realized there was a megalodon in the water. "Is it a forgery, Mr. Vance?" Bethany asked, her voice entirely stripped of its previous venom. It was suddenly very polite, very careful. "The documents have been authenticated by the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and the Holden Group's own internal legal counsel 15 minutes ago," Gregory answered seamlessly. "Ms. Vanguard's identity was masked via legal loophole to protect her privacy during the initial buyout of this failing company 2 years ago." Conrad gripped the back of his chair. His knuckles were bone white. "Failing? I saved this company. I pulled us out of the red." "You didn't save anything, Conrad," Claire said. The anger was gone now, replaced by a crushing, exhausting weight. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man entirely constructed of borrowed bricks. "Your margins were bleeding out. Your grandfather's legacy was 3 weeks away from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You were drinking scotch at 2 PM and crying in our kitchen. I made a phone call. Vanguard wiped out $200 million in bad debt. I bought your debt. I bought your company. I bought your ego." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Several men stood up, shouting over each other. Richard was clutching his chest. Bethany was furiously typing on her phone, already signaling her legal team to halt the merger. "Quiet!" Claire didn't shout, but the sharp, commanding crack of her voice cut through the noise like a gunshot. The room fell silent again. The silence of 20 men realizing their paychecks were held by the woman standing before them. Claire walked over to the head of the table. She stood right next to Conrad. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked like an animal caught in a snare, chewing its own leg off to escape. "You told me last night that I didn't understand legacy," Claire said softly, for his ears only, though the room was quiet enough to hear. "You told me I was dead weight, that I was a nobody." Conrad swallowed hard. The sharp line of his jaw trembled. He reached out, his hand shaking, hovering inches from her arm. Claire, honey, please, let's talk about this. In private. We're married. Whatever this is, we can fix it." The sudden, desperate pivot to affection made Claire's stomach churn violently. The nausea returned, sour and sharp. The smell of his cologne, the scent she used to bury her face into when she felt safe, now made her want to vomit. He was trying to leverage a love he had murdered 12 hours prior. She stepped back, physically repulsed by his proximity. "We are not married, Conrad. I signed the divorce papers you left on the counter. Gregory filed them this morning." Claire turned away from him, looking at the board. "Take your seats, gentlemen. We have a company to run." Slowly, hesitantly, the The men lowered themselves back into their ergonomic chairs. They didn't look at Conrad. They kept their eyes fixed on Claire. The transfer of power was absolute, a physical shift in the room's gravity. Conrad remained standing. He looked around the table, seeking a friendly face, an ally. He found none. The men he had bought, the men he had intimidated, were busy realigning their loyalties to the deepest pocket in the room. "You can't do this," Conrad whispered, a pathetic, leaking sound. "This is my company. My name is on the building." "Actually," Gregory interjected, checking his phone, "a maintenance crew is currently on the roof. The Holden signage is being dismantled as we speak. It is a severe liability to Vanguard's portfolio." Conrad stumbled. He literally lost his footing, catching himself on the edge of the table. He looked at Bethany. "Bethany, tell them. The merger. Our synergy." Bethany zipped her designer briefcase closed. The metallic click was final. She picked it up, smoothing the front of her white dress. She didn't look at Conrad with pity or anger. She looked at him with profound indifference. "There is no merger, Conrad," Bethany said coldly. She turned to Claire, offering a tight, respectful nod. "Ms. Vanguard, a brilliant play. Truly, I apologize for the intrusion. Horizon Tech formally withdraws its acquisition proposal. Have a pleasant morning." Without another word, Bethany turned and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the wood floor, leaving Conrad choking on the dust of his own shattered ambition. Claire pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table, Conrad's chair, and sat down. The leather sighed under her weight. It felt stiff. It felt like a throne built on corpses. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt like a janitor tasked with cleaning up a horrific mess. Conrad stood awkwardly near the corner of the room, near a potted ficus. He looked entirely untethered from reality. His tie was loosened, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like it belonged to a larger man. He was hyperventilating slightly, his mouth open, eyes darting around the room, as if searching for a hidden camera. "Let's move to the first order of business," Claire said, ignoring the man gasping for air in the corner. She looked down the long expanse of mahogany. 20 pairs of eyes stared back, wide and terrified. "Gregory, the floor is yours." Gregory stepped to the side of the table, opening his portfolio again. He didn't use a laser pointer or a PowerPoint presentation. He simply read from a piece of paper, his voice a drone of corporate death. Item 1. The immediate and unconditional termination of Conrad Holden from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective at this exact minute. Cause: gross negligence, fiscal irresponsibility, and breach of fiduciary duty to the majority shareholder. Conrad let out a strangled noise. "Negligence? I doubled our Q3 profits by illegally liquidating employee pension funds to artificially inflate the stock price before the proposed merger," Gregory countered, without looking up. "A federal crime Vanguard's forensic accountants discovered at 4 a.m. this morning. The SEC has been notified. We expect an indictment by Friday." The color completely drained from Conrad's face. He turned a sickly shade of gray. He slumped against the glass wall, his hands clawing at his chest. The bravado, the arrogance, the smug superiority he had worn like a second skin the night before had been violently flayed from his body. Item 2, Gregory continued, unbothered by the human collapse occurring 10 feet away. "The board of directors is hereby dissolved. You will all be provided severance packages commensurate with your complicity in Mr. Holden's fraudulent activities. Security will escort you to your offices to pack your personal belongings. You have 1 hour. A collective gasp swept through the room. Richard half stood, his face purple. You can't fire the entire board. The company will spiral. The stock will plummet. The company is going private, Claire stated softly. I am liquidating the assets. I am selling the divisions for parts. The Holden Group ceases to exist today. Silence. Thick, choking, absolute silence. They weren't just losing their jobs. She was erasing the institution. She was salting the earth so nothing with the Holden name would ever grow again. Why? Conrad whispered from the floor. He had slid down the glass wall, sitting on the plush carpet with his knees pulled to his chest. He looked like a frightened child. Why destroy it? You own it. You could run it. Why burn it down? Claire looked at him. She felt the phantom weight of the broken zipper on her cheap boot from the night before. She remembered the cold rain, the smell of the gutter, the agonizing hollow in her chest when he told her she was a nobody. Because it's infected, Claire said. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. Because it breeds men like you. Men who think loyalty is a transaction and people are disposable. I don't want your legacy, Conrad. I just wanted you to watch it burn. She stood up. The meeting was over. She didn't need a vote. She walked toward the heavy oak doors. The 20 men at the table watched her go, completely paralyzed. As she reached the door, Conrad scrambled to his feet. He lunged toward her, falling to his knees just inches from her stilettos. He reached out, his hands trembling violently, grabbing the hem of her McQueen blazer. Claire, please, he sobbed. Actual tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and oil. His face was a mask of pure terror. I have nothing. If the SEC, I'll go to prison. I'm broke. I have nothing. Please. I loved you. I made a mistake. I was stupid. Please, Claire. Claire looked down at the man clutching her coat. She smelled the bitter tang of his tears. She saw the desperation, the absolute destruction of his ego. She had won. She had executed the perfect revenge. And yet, looking at him groveling on the floor, she felt absolutely nothing. No joy. No dark thrill. Just a profound, sweeping exhaustion. He wasn't a titan falling from grace. He was just a pathetic, greedy man who had finally run out of other people's money. She gently reached down and pried his fingers off her blazer, one by one. It's raining outside, Conrad, Claire said, her voice a quiet, empty whisper. You might want to grab a coat. She turned and walked out the door, the heavy oak swinging shut behind her, sealing him inside the glass tomb of his own making. The sound of her heels faded down the carpeted hallway, leaving nothing but the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of a man weeping for a world that no longer existed. Gravity returned the instant the elevator doors sealed her away from the executive floor. Claire leaned her head back against the mirrored wall, letting the cold steel bite through the thick wool of her blazer to chill her spine. The descent was rapid, leaving her stomach hovering somewhere near the 50th floor. She swallowed hard, trying to clear the painful pressure building behind her eardrums. Gregory stood completely motionless beside her, an obelisk in a tailored suit. He held the black leather portfolio loosely at his side. It contained the ashes of Conrad's entire existence, yet it looked no heavier than a stack of grocery coupons. "Are you requiring medical attention?" Gregory asked, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor indicator. "Your pulse is visibly elevated at the carotid artery." "No," Claire rasped. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She had been grinding her teeth so violently during the confrontation that her molars throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. "I just want to take this suit off." The lobby was a different landscape than the one she had navigated 30 minutes prior. The news of the hostile takeover had already bled down through the building's internal servers. The two security guards who had tried to block her path earlier were now standing rigidly by the turnstiles, actively staring at the ceiling to avoid eye contact. The air smelled acutely of industrial floor wax and collective, suffocating panic. She walked through the revolving glass doors and out into the late morning. The sun was aggressively bright now, a harsh, unforgiving glare reflecting off the hood of the waiting black Maybach. The humidity from last night's storm was already baking off the pavement, creating a thick, sticky heat that clung to her bare ankles. The driver opened the heavy rear door. Claire slid into the back seat. The door clunked shut, immediately severing the chaotic noise of the city. The silence inside the cabin was total, insulated by bulletproof glass and acoustic dampening. It smelled of expensive, conditioned leather and ozone. "The Four Seasons," Gregory instructed the driver, settling into the opposite seat. Claire rested her forehead against the cool, tinted window, watching the pedestrians blur past. She had expected to feel a rush of vindication. For 3 years, she had contorted herself into a small, convenient shape to fit inside Conrad's ego. She had done the laundry, balanced his personal checkbook, and listened to him practice his speeches in the mirror. She had let him feel like a titan while hiding the fact that she owned the ground he walked on. Destroying him should have been a triumph. Instead, her chest felt like a hollowed-out cavern. The revenge didn't rewind the clock. It didn't bring back the man she thought she had married, because that man had never actually existed. Conrad was merely a projection, a corporate hologram fueled by her hidden money. She hadn't just executed a hostile takeover, she had euthanized her own illusion. The grief hit her suddenly, a sharp physical cramp directly beneath her ribs. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, leaning forward. "Ms. Vanguard," Gregory said quietly, "the SEC has issued the preliminary freeze on his personal accounts. The news networks have picked up the board dissolution. Holden stock is currently in free fall. It will be delisted by the closing bell." "And the lower-level employees?" Claire asked, her voice muffled as she stared at the rubber floor mat. "The mailroom, the custodial staff, the administrative assistants. Their contracts are voided under the liquidation clause." "No," Claire said, sitting up straight. The nausea was still there, but a sudden, sharp clarity cut through the fog. "I am dismantling the executives, Gregory, not the people who empty the trash cans. Calculate a severance package for every employee below the director level, 3 years of their current salary, fully vested health care, and letters of recommendation from Vanguard. Pay it out of my personal holding accounts before the assets are frozen." Gregory paused. He blinked slowly, recalculating the variables. "That is an entirely emotional expenditure. It is fiscally highly inefficient." "I don't care," Claire said, turning to look at him. "Do it. I refuse to become him." 20 minutes later, Claire stood alone in the marble bathroom of her hotel suite. The heavy titanium trunk sat open in the bedroom. She unclasped the vintage platinum watch. It hit the marble counter with a heavy, definitive clack. She peeled off the McQueen blazer, letting it drop carelessly to the floor. The stiff fabric held its shape for a second before collapsing into a dark, expensive puddle. She leaned over the sink, turning the water to pure cold. She splashed it onto her face, scrubbing roughly at her skin. The matte red lipstick was stubborn. It smeared across her cheek, making her look like she had been bleeding from the mouth, before finally washing away down the drain in pale pink swirls. She grabbed a thick white towel and pressed it to her face, breathing in the scent of fresh cotton. When she lowered the towel, she looked at her reflection in the steam-free mirror. The bags under her eyes were dark and heavy. Her hair was a mess. She looked exhausted, broken, and deeply, imperfectly human. She wasn't a nobody anymore. But she also wasn't the ruthless machine Conrad had forced her to be for 20 minutes in a boardroom. She walked out of the bathroom, stepping carefully over the discarded suit. She picked up the cracked, 3-year-old phone from her bedside table. The screen was still completely dead from the diner coffee. She tossed it into the nearest wastebasket. Claire sat down on the edge of the massive, empty bed, listening to the faint, distant sound of traffic hundreds of feet below. The empire had fallen. The king was dethroned, and the architect of it all finally allowed herself to sit in the quiet ruins, pull her knees to her chest, and cry for the deeply ordinary life she had just burned to the ground. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a signed document and a locked door. Claire proved that being a nobody is the most dangerous disguise a person can wear. But the fallout of absolute power is never perfectly clean. Did Conrad get exactly what he deserved? Or is the reality of vengeance always a little bit hollow? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a brilliant comeback, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, thrilling stories.